clinical nightfall selection and experiment. A gaunt man was hauled across the wooden floor and shoved beneath a single swinging lamp while the camp doctor tapped a pen against his clipboard. Betrayal tightened the survivor's jaw. He had once trusted the uniformed guard who handed him over, and that conviction made him hold a folded scrap inside his palm. The doctor, hands steady, wrote a number on the man's wrist and marked a column on the ledger. Selected, the infirmary smelled of metal and boiled bandages. Light cut across the man's collarbone and revealed the faded stripes of his garment. Within 3 breaths, witnesses were present. 2 encos, a sullen orderly, and the man who would later be called the camp doctor. The narrator did not linger on sentiment. He catalogued facts. The selection was routine. The lamp was positioned deliberately over a table, and the clipboard was a recurring instrument in the camp's medical program. The survivor, later recorded as a composite in testimonies, breathed short, shallow attempts to steady himself. He kept his scrap folded tight. When by the doctor whether he was ill, the survivor did not answer. He had a name and a number, but he also had a secret ledger fragment folded against his ribs. The scene shifted down the corridor as the narrator moved the record camera. The survivor stumbled past stacked bunks, each plank showing a gouge or a carved initial, and a crate labeled with bureaucratic ink. Other prisoners watched from thin blankets. The narrator read aloud a registration index while the survivor traced the edge of his cloth. "We counted them like sacks," the narrator said, voice flat. The tone was factual, not furious. A new piece of data appeared. The camp's medical program targeted those with certain markings, small scars, or family names registered under odd categories. A clerk then carried a box of thin paper sheets into the infirmary. The doctor, with a clipped voice, began to argue criteria with an unseen orderly. "No fever, no immediate infection," the doctor said. "But this one's cache of symptoms is sufficient for study," the orderly answered in 2 words and moved to steady the patient. The doctor's hands were methodical. He felt no hesitation when he ordered the restraints. That clinical indifference was a procedural fact recorded in multiple reports and repeated across witness lists. The survivor's breath was shallow. His fingers clenched the scrap harder. Betrayal drove him to keep that paper. He had traded sleep for an opportunity to prove the ledger existed. He walked under the lamp because he believed, concretely, that the ledger could name names and stop lies. The narrator described how the patient's wrist met the ink, the pen's tip leaving a dark loop of identification. The ledger entry converted a human into a line item. That conversion, the narrator said, was the central problem of the chapter. The camp had formalized cruelty as research input. In the repurposed storage room lab, a bench sat under an open window without glass. Instruments lay in trays. The doctor tapped a metal instrument, and then his pocket scalpel flashed in a single reflected ray. He adjusted his pince, and leaned over the selected prisoner, while an orderly held the man's shoulder. "Camp doctor." The narrator identified him by role and manner. "State your reason for incision," the doctor said. His voice had a clinical baritone that registered on tape as calm and exact for data. The doctor answered to no one in particular and proceeded. Dialogue spread through the room in short bursts. "Camp doctor, stop." The survivor gasped. "You will not." The doctor cut across him. "You are a subject," he said. "Subject," the orderly repeated. The prisoner stopped speaking when the doctor snapped the strap. Hands moved with purpose. The narrator noted every movement as if listing catalog entries. Straps fastened, name tags checked, instruments sterilized in a pail of antiseptic. The survivor's mouth formed a single word and then silence. The camera recorded the set of reactions in the faces around him. Outside in the corridor, the narrator overlaid archival pages while the survivor was led back past bunks. A second event punctured the sequence. A guard shoved a small crate that spilled numbered armbands across the floor. Prisoners bent to pick up the bands. The survivor stooped and palmed one. He tucked it under his rag. The narrator read aloud a header from a file. a ledger listing test subjects and final outcomes. The numbers were terse. Recovery next to one name, deceased next to another, and a column of empty cells labeled notes. The ledger's blankness told more than the scribbles. At the dim corner of the infirmary, the narrator and the survivor unfolded the ledger. A pulse ran through the scene when the survivor traced a line and pointed to a crossed-out note that contradicted an earlier report. "He only look," the narrator narrated the act and the discovery. Some survivals had been doctored, some deaths omitted, and several medical outcomes reversed on paper. The ledger turned anonymous suffering into cold statistics, and those statistics had been altered to hide lethal procedures. That falsification changed the stakes by converting eyewitness memory into a contested record. Confrontation came sooner than the doctor expected. The survivor produced a concealed scrap of paper taken from beneath his garments. It contained a scribbled notation naming the attending technician who had signed off on a fatality. The doctor, who had previously treated the ledger as immutable, realized his own notes could be exposed. His pupils narrowed behind the pince nez. "Who gave you that?" he demanded. The survivor did not answer with words. He let the scrap unfold on the table for everyone to see. Hands reached toward the paper. An orderly stepped forward. Rapid dialogue followed, short and tense. "Show me," the doctor said. "Show me your proof." The doctor repeated. "You lie," the orderly said. "You signed it," the survivor whispered, and named the technician. The technician, who had been out of frame until that moment, stepped toward the light with a hard face. He pushed his cap back. "I signed true," he said. The doctor and the technician traded accusations. The narrator marked the shift. Doubt had become anger, and anger had become fear. The first emotion shift was complete. Suspicion had moved into fear for exposure. Prisoners were summoned. They crowded into the barrack yard that had been converted into an impromptu assembly space. The survivor carried the scrap as if it were a weapon. He read aloud the notation, the name, the date, the operation designation. Voices rose. "We were told different." Someone shouted, "We were told yes." Another voice answered. The doctor looked smaller under the collective gaze. The narrator recorded the mounting pressure. As the crowd repeated the ledger's contradictions, the doctor's authority fractured. The exchange escalated into a 3 to 6 line rapid back and forth between named figures. "Camp doctor," the survivor said. "You lied to them. You accuse me without cause." The doctor replied. "You signed false outcomes." The survivor answered. "You cannot prove it." The doctor insisted. The technician stared down at the paper and then at the crowd. "I signed what I was told to sign," he said. "Who you?" The survivor demanded orders. The technician whispered. Those lines were short, clipped, and repeated the names often. Survivor, camp doctor, technician. The rhythm of accusation forced decisions into the open. An external event forced the next pivot. A guard pushed through the crowd and raised a baton. The doctor seized the moment to reassert authority. He barked an order and pointed to a line of crates. "Contain them," he said. The guards moved in. Hands reached for the ledger scrap. A prisoner lunged and snatched the paper back. He folded it and slid it beneath his shirt as if hiding a coin. The narrator noted the action. Containment had arrived and the experiment's exposure reached a violent peak. The doctor lashed out verbally and then physically. He struck a table which sent instruments clattering. A syringe rolled across the floor. Someone screamed, "Camp doctor, stop," a prisoner said, and the doctor shoved him aside. The guard pinned the survivor with heavy hands. The crowd shouted the names of those listed in the ledger. The doctor barked a final order. The guards took the technician and held him against the wall. That was the chapter's climax. The experiment sequence, exposed, had provoked a public confrontation that the doctor attempted to suppress. Bleeding tension did not end in silence. After the confrontation, a small group of prisoners gathered in a washroom alcove to hide copies of the ledger. 2 prisoners crawled beneath a washstand. One folded the ledger pages into cigarette paper and crammed them into a hollowed wooden peg. Another stuffed names into the lining of a cap. The survivor, trembling, traced a name and whispered it aloud to the others. "Remember Anna?" he said. "Remember Jacob?" he added. The narrator recorded the preservation acts as concrete work. Copying, folding, hiding. The second emotion shift occurred here. Fear shifted into guarded determination. The doctor was restrained by his own guards, while the camp's officers argued over procedure. He watched from the sidelines with a face like stone, adjusting his pince, nez as if checking a slide. The narrator narrated the restraint as a procedural fact and catalogued the doctor's postures. Hands folded, back straight, mouth compressed. The ledger's exposure had not freed anyone, but it had created witnesses. Those witnesses acted in small, precise ways to preserve testimony. The narrative emphasized that documentation would survive even as the camp tightened its controls. One prisoner, named Thomas in later accounts, smuggled a copied page out hidden in a mattress seam. He carried it to a bunk where two other men waited. They read the names in low voices, and each repeated the list aloud so memory would anchor the pages. Dialogues were short and practical. "Thomas, where did you get this?" "Under the washstand, hide it." The men counted names. "Anna," one said. "Jacob," another repeated. The narrator recorded the sound of names like inventory. Repetition turned memory into a shared fact. A surprising reveal occurred. The survivor found a marginal note in the ledger that implicated a mid-level officer in ordering falsifications. The name appeared alongside a stamped command signature. This twist changed the listener's understanding. The falsification was not a single doctor's act, but part of a command chain. The narrator highlighted the twist as a concrete discovery. A stamped signature that matched an officer's handwriting. The officer had been seen earlier in the barrack yard distributing armbands. Now his handwriting linked him to the ledger's edits. That discovery triggered a new confrontation. Prisoners pressed toward the officer's tent. The officer denied knowledge and insisted on paperwork. "You have no proof," he said. The survivor stepped forward and held the scrapped paper above his head. "I have this," he said. The officer paled under the lamp. The guards stepped in and separated them. The narrator captured the scene with short sentences and direct claims of action. The confrontation resolved into containment again. The officer's denial did not resolve the ledger's evidence. The narrator closed the chapter with a precise, concrete promise. The ledger copies were hidden. A few names survived. The camp's record-keeping had been exposed but not yet dismantled. The survivor watched from a bunk as dawn leaked pale through grime. He folded his strip of striped cloth and tucked the scrap beneath it. He did not speak about feelings. Instead, he sealed an envelope with a string and slid it under a floorboard. The narrator catalogued the act as witness preservation rather than emotional catharsis. The final paragraph ends on an action connected to the chapter's events. A guard rapped the infirmary door twice, hard. Two prisoners froze and looked at one another. The survivor tightened his fingers around the hidden ledger fragment and slid his hand to the floorboard gap. The narrator noted the knock as the immediate cue that the containment would continue, but that names had been passed into secret places. The ledger would surface again, the narrator said, but not as an abstract hope, as specific papers carried by Thomas, hidden by the washstand, and sealed beneath a bunk. The chapter closed with that concrete beat. A knock at the door and the survivor drawing the floorboard down around the paper he had sworn to save. Erosion of trust, the forced procedure. Guards shoved the gaunt man across the corridor. His left wrist snagged on splintered wood, and the folded scrap burned against his palm. Betrayal tightened his jaw as the camp doctor stepped into the lamp hallow and said, "This one goes to the bench," in a voice that treated the words like a clinical note. The urgency was immediate. He had to keep the scrap hidden, and he had to survive the procedure. That sense of betrayal, of a familiar uniform handing him over, shaped each motion he made as they pushed him toward the infirmary. The corridor smelled of stale smoke and boiled cabbage. Concrete flaked under boot heels. The survivor had been taken from the bunkroom hours earlier. He had watched a guard he had once trusted exchange a clipped nod with the doctor. He had no time for explanation. The conflict was clear and present. Remain silent and risk annihilation, or reveal the scrap and invite interrogation. The scrap itself was a concrete object. A page torn from a notebook, edges ragged, a single crossed, outline visible when he clenched his fist. He kept his fingers tight around it as if pressure alone could seal the truth. They shoved him into the makeshift infirmary and dropped him onto a rusted bench. The doctor flicked the lamp on and scanned the room with a practiced indifference name. The assistant asked, "Clipboard tapping paper." The survivor answered in a voice that scraped like gravel. "I can give a name. Number." Then the assistant counted 42. Another voice supplied, the orderly S-tone flat. The exchange felt like a ledger entry. The men treated living bodies as lines to be filed. The survivor's hands trembled when they undid his thin clothing. His fingers closed harder around the scrap. The opening confrontation set the chapter's problem plainly. The camp's clinical cruelty would be enforced today, and whatever small proof the survivor held might either ruin him or become the seed of exposure. He felt suspicion first, who had handed him over and why, but suspicion shifted into fear as the instruments were laid out. He tried to recall the exact moment from earlier nights when the guard had touched his arm and whispered, "Be ready." The scrap's folded corner had been pressed into his palm with that whisper. That memory returned not as a blur but as a clear, tactile instant. A knuckle pressing skin, a face turned away, "Strip him down," the orderly said, and two hands pulled the striped shirt over the survivor's head. He fought the light in his eyes with reflexive squints, then let the world be small and bright under the lamp. The doctor walked the bench slowly, fingertips tapping a clipboard. He read aloud numbers and vital signs as if reciting a recipe. The survivor heard the words but registered only the scrape of metal instruments and the thud of his own breathing. He forced himself to time his breaths with the lamp's tiny flicker, to keep the scrap pressed against his palm. The doctor lowered his voice when the assistant stepped closer. "We need clean results by dawn," he said, folding the clipboard closed for emphasis. "Publishable findings," he added under his breath. The assistant hesitated. "Doctor, the last subject nearly died. Then we note it as mortality variance," the doctor snapped. They argued in clipped, practical sentences about methods and deadlines while the survivor lay strapped and listened. The argument revealed something the survivor could not see at first. The doctor's motives were not merely ideological. They bent on career, on recognition. The assistant's hand jittered when she reached for a syringe. A brief, sharp exchange occurred between the doctor and the assistant that contained 3 quick lines of back and forth, "Faster," the doctor said. "We risk contamination with delay," the assistant replied. "Then adjust the parameters." The doctor shot back. "I want to falsify numbers," the assistant insisted. The doctor leaned close enough for the scent of antiseptic to mix with his breath. He touched the edge of the clipboard and tapped a single, deliberate finger. The survivor felt a flicker of hope. If the assistant resisted, there might be room to survive. Hope shifted into dread when the doctor barked an order, and 2 guards tightened the restraints. Hands bound the survivor to the bench with coarse straps. An orderly held his shoulders while the doctor checked the instruments laid on a stained tray. The room had 1 lamp, 1 bench, and a second prisoner forced to watch across the doorway. His presence turned the procedure into a demonstration more than a surgery. The other prisoner whispered very low. "Hold on." The survivor tried to answer, but the gag stopped him. The watching man's eyes tracked the doctor's hands and then the survivor's fingers, and in that angle the survivor felt both exposure and connection. He shoved his attention into the scrap again, pressing it flat against the bench surface so the seam would hide it. The doctor cleaned a small area on the survivor's arm and talked in an explanatory voice as he worked. "We will test resilience under controlled caloric restriction," he said. As if labeling a jar, "We will observe physiological decline. You call this research," the assistant murmured. "I call it results," the doctor said. While they spoke, the survivor's memory returned to the previous night's selection. A gaunt man hauled across a wooden floor, shoved beneath a single lamp, a folded scrap pressed into his palm. That earlier event was concrete and raw. It guided how he now moved his fingers, how he timed a breath, how he let the gag sit so saliva would not choke him. The memory from Chapter 1 anchored his choices here. As the procedure began, the doctor made a small incision and inserted a probe. The sensation was immediate and mechanical. Pressure, the metallic taste of blood at the back of the survivor's throat, the surprise flare of pain that spread as an exact, local injury. He bit through the gag to make a sound stop. The other prisoner shouted from the doorway. Guards slammed into the threshold and hauled the interrupter into the corridor. The commotion was meant to draw attention and possibly create a window. It did exactly that, forcing 2 guards to leave the bench unattended for a breath. That breath was a pivot. The assistant used it to slide a torn page from the doctor's notebook into her coat pocket, while the doctor shouted at the doorway intrusion. The act was quiet and precise, a fold, a tuck, a hand closing over paper. For a second the survivor felt the world tilt, evidence had been smuggled out. But the relief was cut by the guard's return and a brutal punishment in the hallway that echoed back into the infirmary. The interrupter's screams were muffled and then ceased. The doctor returned to the bench and resumed the procedure with ironical calm. Pain intensified. The doctor adjusted dials and measured responses with instruments, calling out numbers as if on a ledger. 1.2, he said. Then 1.4, voice steady. The survivor's jaw clenched. He tried to focus on the count. Breath count hold. He squeezed his fingers until knuckles popped. The doctor spoke without empathy, detailing temperature fluctuation and pulse response. The victim's eyes watched the lamp's bulb and the pool of reflected light on the doctor's spectacles. He felt betrayed, then resolute. Betrayal had initially propelled him to conceal the scrap, but now that concealment transformed into a choice. He could try to use the scrap to expose the falsified records the doctor scribbled over, or he could keep it secret and survive one more day. Midway through the procedure, a subtle discovery shifted power. The survivor's thumb, slick with sweat, brushed the scrap and opened it enough to show a crossed-out entry and a second, overwritten line. The scrap revealed that the doctor had altered outcomes before. He had been claiming mortality as variance. The scrap showed intentional manipulation. The survivor could not speak, but the assistant's eyes flicked to his hand. She read the corner of the page when the doctor turned away for a moment, and a new calculation passed over her face. Her hesitation turned into an angle of defiance. The assistant spoke under her breath to the orderly. 3 terse lines, he altered this, she said. We can be blamed if we cover it. The orderly replied. Then we keep 1 copy, she said. The exchange was quick and unvarnished. The assistant slid her hand toward her coat again, not for destruction but for preservation. That preservation became a turning point. Someone inside the system had decided that an internal ledger could become an external accusation. The survivor tightened his jaw and let his eyes communicate what his mouth could not. Hold, wait, watch. Outside, a small uprising played like a desperate counterpoint. A fellow prisoner had started a commotion to draw guards away. He hurled his plate and screamed the name of a guard who had beaten him earlier. The guard left and 2 others chased the interrupter down the barrack lane. The plan aimed to create a distraction and deliver a hidden instrument toward the bench. It failed. Guards returned with boots and a whip, and the interrupter was dragged back into view for punishment. The room's temperature shifted. The doctor's face tightened and he accelerated the procedure. The failed attempt increased the danger and forced quicker, rougher action. The doctor performed the invasive measures in a systematic manner. He took blood samples, recorded vitals, and adjusted a crude respirator. The survivor's body registered each incision precisely. A hot prick, a dull ache, a lancing core that moved under the skin. He kept his chin up to watch the doctor's face. How many subjects has he done this week? The survivor tried to mouth toward the other prisoner. The other man answered with a short, rasping whisper. Too many dialogue and human exchange threaded through the procedure in halting bursts, short lines that held facts and warnings. At one moment the doctor glanced at the assistant's pocket where the torn page rested. His eyes narrowed, the only change in an otherwise impassive face. He whispered, not loud enough for the assistants at the doorway. You removed a page. The assistant's fingers tightened. She had to decide whether to hand the page back and erase the trace, or to retain it and risk exposure. Her choice mattered more than the survivor's immediate survival. It threatened the doctor's reputation and could end careers. She chose preservation. The page stayed tucked, and she leaned into the orderly to steady her hand as if the physical posture could cover her decision. The climax of the chapter arrived as the doctor began the most invasive test. He lowered the lamp and focused on a single data point, pushing an instrument deeper while documenting the survivor's responses. Pain turned acute and the room's motions narrowed to the mechanical. The survivor's hands flexed against straps. His breath came ragged. The doctor spoke in clipped, factual lines. Response: tachycardia. Note the threshold. The assistant counted aloud the pulses while the orderly adjusted the restraints. The mechanical litany of numbers overlapped with the human sounds. The survivor's panting, the other prisoner stifled sobs, the distant echo of the interrupted uprising being punished in the yard. During the peak, a quick sequence of confrontational dialogue erupted at the instrument table. You already marked the results wrong, the assistant said. We need the numbers as is, the doctor replied. That is fabrication, the assistant pushed. It ensures supply and funding, the doctor snapped. Then we burn the ledger. The assistant hissed, and the doctor laughed a short, cold laugh. That argument, 3 to 6 lines, revealed motives and split the perpetrator ranks. It also created a brief window where the doctor's attention faltered, and the survivor used the motion to tuck the scrap further into the bench seam. After the procedure, they moved him back toward the bunk room with a cleaner gait and a locked mouth. The assistant had passed the torn page to an inside pocket earlier. She now moved through the corridor with a purpose that suggested danger and protection simultaneously. The survivor's body felt hollowed but not defeated. He kept testing his limbs. Muscles tightened and then loosened with each step. He recognized one concrete sign of being alive, the H that lingered under his ribs when he inhaled. That physical measure replaced abstract courage. He resolved in small rigid motions to record details later in hidden ink and not to trust names. The assistant slipped into a back room and placed the torn page inside the hem of a coat belonging to a laundry prisoner known to move with fewer checks. She left a faint scent of disinfectant on the fabric, a deliberate marker for retrieval. This choreography, pages tucked, coats moved, signals left in smell, served as the colony's fragile network of communication. The survivor caught the assistant's sigh in the corridor. The look was brief and full of instruction. He nodded minutely. The nod constituted a decision. To live through the record and keep memory as a weapon. Dawn crept along the camp perimeter and the survivor lay on a narrow bunk while other men stirred and went about chores. He listened for boots and the tick of someone counting heads. He pressed his thumb over the faded number on his wrist and felt the skin there, thin and papery. The narrator catalogued the scene with an exactness that denied sentiment. Straps loosened, wash water turned cold, a blanket folded at the foot of the bunk. The survivor forced himself to name details aloud in a low voice so he would not forget them later. The doctor's habit of adjusting pints, Nez glasses, the assistant's jitter in the right hand, the way the orderly clicked his tongue when nervous. Outside, the camp tightened. Guards made rounds with a closer cadence and questions became shorter. The assistant's discreet transfer of the page had not gone unnoticed in the highest echelons. The doctor had circled the list of subjects and underlined certain names. The survivor heard talk at the mess table about new directives to destroy extraneous notes. That talk placed the record and the assistant's theft into real danger. The stakes grew from individual survival to evidence preservation. The survivor understood that if the torn page reached external investigators, it could undo the doctor's carefully staged ledger. The chapter ended with a deliberate, concrete beat. The survivor sat upright on his bunk and folded his hands around the scrap he had kept hidden in his skin until now. He could not read the whole page by lamp light in the bunk room, but the corner showed the doctor's handwriting and a line crossed out and rewritten. The assistant had left a small token, an iodine mark on the collar of a coat in the wash pile, to signal retrieval. He stood and walked toward the laundry hut with two other prisoners who moved like shadows. As he stepped into the hut, the door creaked and someone outside called a guard's number in a casual, staged voice. The call was real and immediate. Either the guard's arrival would intercept the retrieval, or the scrap would pass into the wash and towards safety. That specific moment, door creak, shouted head count, a coat with a mark, closed the chapter on a concrete, unresolved action while resolving the chapter's conflict. Evidence had moved from danger toward preservation, and the camp's network had been tested. The survivor's emotion route, betrayal, had driven every choice. From hiding the scrap the night he was handed over, to timing his breaths beneath the lamp, to agreeing, without words, to the assistant's plan. Emotion shifted at least twice, suspicion to fear, then fear to tentative trust, and each shift manifested in a physical response. Tightened jaw, a paused breath, a small nod. The chapter left the immediate procedure resolved. The experiment continued, the victim survived the night, and a torn page now moved through a fragile chain. It did not promise justice, only a dangerous record and people whose choices might determine whether the ledger stood or crumbled. The final image is specific and active. The survivor slipping a folded scrap into a coat in the laundry hut, while a guard's call sounds outside the door. The narrator closed the account without commentary. The torn page had a pulse. The camp tightened its net. The next decision would not come from the survivor alone. Final measure smuggled truth and reckoning. The survivor's hand tightened on the folded scrap as guards shoved him through the low doorway into the records room. Betrayal sat like grit under his teeth. He had expected punishment, not the chance that names on a scrap of paper might be read aloud. Marek's jaw clenched because the man who pushed him here had once been gentle when rations came. That change in a familiar face hardened every decision Marek made. A lamp swung over a table. The camp doctor tapped his pen against a clipboard and did not look surprised to see Marek arrive. The problem was simple and urgent. If the scrap left this room, someone could trace the lists, and those lists carried the names of people who had tried to stop the experiments. That fact shaped everything the survivor would do next. Marek did not speak at first. He let the lamp paint his knuckles white around paper. The narrator noted the moment with clinical precision. Marek had been hauled across the wooden floor in Chapter 1, and his left wrist had snagged on splintered wood in Chapter 2. That same wound stung now as he curled his fingers. The emotion root here is betrayal. It drove him to hide the scrap inside a folded palm and to risk a move that could either smother proof or set it free. He moved deliberately, not out of bravery but out of calculation born from hurt. Survivor. The camp doctor said without lifting his gaze from the ledger he pretended to consult, "Open your hand." Now, Marek remained silent. He stared at the lamp's filament and breathed in shallow, measured pulls, the mannerism the records had learned to read as fear. A catalogue clerk, thin and watchful, Set a ledger beside the doctor's clipboard. The junior guard, Claus, kept his fingers on the lamp at switch as if to flick the light and expose whatever Merrick still held. Camp Doctor, Merrick at last. And his voice cracked. I done te have anything, sir. The doctor's hand stayed on the clipboard. Survivor, do not waste time. Show the item. Merrick's first emotion shift arrived as suspicion shifted into a tighter fear. He watched the doctor's fingers, noted the ink stains, and registered how the pen tap accelerated when the doctor's eyes skated toward his wrist. Betrayal had taught him to read small things, the angle of a pen, the pattern of a cough. He felt the folded scrap press against his palm, where the faded number tattoo on his wrist had burned in earlier chapters. The clerks began to read aloud inventory numbers in a monotone to fill the room with administration. The sound was deliberate, paperwork muffled outcries. Merrick used the cadence to shift his posture toward the nearest stack of records. He needed an ally in the room who understood how to pass paper without the doctor registering a theft. A fellow prisoner in the records unit, Jacob, slid from behind a stack and stood near the doorway. Jacob's wrists bore the same faded lines as Merrick's. He carried a thin pencil and 2 blank index cards in a pocket. He had worked in the archives for weeks and had learned how to fold, copy, and misplace entries under the guise of cataloging. Jacob caught Merrick's eye and gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Jacob moved with the quiet of someone who had pried a loose board once and learned the right angle to press it. He took one step, then another measured glide and made his hand pass near Merrick's elbow. Merrick slid the scrap into Jacob's jacket seam in a single practiced motion. The doctor's head tilted fractionally, but he did not look fully. He was counting categories, not people. The second emotion shift, fear shifting into a fragile hope, occurred as Merrick watched Jacob tuck the paper away. Hope here was not a feeling described. It was a choice. Merrick's fingers relaxed enough to let go. What is that? Claus, louder than intended. He had seen hands move near coats before. He thought to check. He stepped forward, boots scraping the concrete. Claus carried the look of a man who was learning to obey and learning when to hesitate. The junior guard had not yet decided which side of the ledger he wanted to be on. The camp doctor raised his voice for the first time. Claus, keep the light steady. Clerk read the next inventory. He used the orders to pull attention away from Jacob's seam. Survivor, explain. Jacob did the smallest, most dangerous thing. He bent toward the clerk and commented on a catalog number. A soft, practical sentence that could have been about nothing. 32-7 is out of order. Jacob, may I refile it? The clerk nodded, eyes skimming the ledger's columns. The room bent toward procedure, toward the official act of placing a slip into a file. That small, administrative ask created a physical gap that allowed the scrap to breathe near the seam. Merrick felt the doctor's scrutiny as a sharp thing at the base of his skull. He had been on benches before. He had felt scalpel tips, smelled alcohol, heard the clinical baritone of the doctor rationalizing pain as data. He forced his voice into a tone that sounded like compliance. Survivor, he said to the doctor, I will answer anything you need. The doctor lifted his head and smiled thinly. Camp doctor, he said, we will clarify the data. This will be a final procedure. We will record precise responses. He spoke the way a man names an instrument. The procedure was an object to be arranged. An external event interrupted the taut administration. A clerk's foot hit a loose floorboard, and the sound echoed. The doctor flinched toward the noise. Close attention snapped to the corridor. That micro-distraction gave Jacob a chance to fish a copy pencil from his pocket and begin to trace the scrap on an index card. He worked with the practiced slowness of a man who had to make a copy without looking like a thief. Jacob's copying was the mid-chapter cliffhanger. Would the trace be accurate? Would the doctor notice the longer shape of a folded name list? Merrick's throat tightened as he watched the pencil scrape. Jacob, he mouthed, the single syllable a command and a plea. Jacob did not answer. He kept his head down and pretended to file the index card. His hand trembled. That trimmer was visible. It was a small failure of secrecy. A clerk glanced downward and then away, eyes trained to avoid trouble. The ledger's columns captured inventory. The index card captured names. The room held both truths. The doctor announced then that they would begin the final procedure. Guards stepped forward with ropes and straps while the doctor laid out a small pocket scalpel and a rusted tray of instruments. We need cooperation. This is for the record. The instruments were positioned like punctuation marks at the edge of the bench. Marek's ribs ached from holding breath. His hands involuntarily flexed around the scar on his wrist. Before binding began, a junior guard, one of the clerks who had become a guard to survive, named Erich in the records, made a decision that would change the course of the morning. Erich slipped the doctor's clipboard closed and, under the cover of repositioning a lamp, pried the lower corner where he knew the doctor kept notes. His fingers brushed paper that listed victims, dates, and a reference code that matched the scrap's numbering. Erich read aloud an entry by accident as he adjusted the clipboard. March 21st, respiratory trials, subject 32, 7, blood loss recorded. He did not mean to speak. His voice betrayed him. The room stopped its procedural grind and listened. The doctor's face went from composed to hot in a tangible flicker. Erich, the doctor snapped, close that. He moved for the clipboard. Erich did not close it. He had, in the preceding weeks, watched other men die under the name of science. The ledger in his hands listed names he had fed wood to, names he had watched be marched away. He had read the ledger and discovered that the experiments were catalogued, that the camp kept a numbered index, and that these numbers matched the faded tattoos on prisoners' arms. He did an action that changed him. He slid the clipboard toward the clerk and said, softly, read this aloud. The clerk, startled and puzzled, began to read. The doctor's hand slammed onto the page. The ledger revealed a twist. The doctor's notes were not only clinical. They contained funding codes and references to an office outside the camp. That single line shifted the stakes. The experiments were not the product of one doctor's zeal, but part of a wider network. Marek understood in the half-second it took the guard to recoil that the names on the scrap implicated more than local cruelty. The doctor moved then with a speed that contradicted his earlier composure. Camp Dr. Klaus, step away. There was hesitation in Klaus's voice. Camp Doctor, Klaus repeated. Louder. The doctor's voice sharpened. Klaus, control your men. Do not act on emotion. He reached for his pocket scalpel and then stopped, calculating whether violence now would bury the ledger or only make copies escape on frightened hands. Jakob, seeing the doctor's hand, slid the traced index card into his palm and shoved it toward a seam of his jacket meant to keep one small copy hidden. He had made 2 copies, one exact, one scribbled in Shorthand that only he and Marek could read. Jakob. Marek hissed. Run. Jakob froze, then ducked his head and pushed toward the narrow service corridor leading away from the records room. A guard called after him. The doctor lunged. The movement created chaos. Papers scattered. The lamp swung, and the lamp's light skimmed ledger pages as if libretto sheets had been thrown into air. The climax, marked in the outline, arrived as the doctor reached for Jakob and the ledger landed on the bench between Marek and the table. Marek made a choice that men in chains rarely have the luxury of making. When the doctor lunged, Marek shoved forward, drove his shoulder into the doctor's ribs, and knocked the clipboard out of reach. The doctor staggered and struck the bench with his forehead. He cursed the pain and snapped for guards to seize Marek. The guards split. Some moved to restrain Marek while Klaus, torn, stepped back and then, decisively, grabbed the clipboard and thrust it toward the clerk. Klaus, what are you doing? The doctor rasped, blood at his temple. Klaus, Erich in a voice that had learned to be louder. I'm taking this. I am taking evidence. He did not sound like a man seeking credit. He sounded like a man deciding to tell truth. The ledger, the scrap, the index card, all those objects shifted the balance. The doctor's calm evaporated into striking blame. Survivor. The doctor spat. You will pay. He reached for the scalpel. The guard nearest Marek tightened the rope. Marek's breath hitched. He had to choose between letting the doctor proceed or pushing further into chaos. He pushed. Marek's second decisive action was blunt. He grabbed the doctor's wrist and pried the scalpel loose with a motion that was half practical and half raw. Survivor. Marek, short and flat, no more. The doctor's hand jerked. A clerk screamed. The doctor saw, then lunged for Marek's throat. Guards tumbled across the bench. There followed 3 to 6 sharp exchanges of commands and rebuttals as men collided and spoke over one another. Let him go, Claus ordered. Drop the blade. Erich barked. Jack up! Marek snapped. The lines were quick and concrete. Every line moved bodies. The doctor's voice cut between the shouts. You will not take this. This is my work. The doctor reached, raving over ownership, as if the ledger belonged to his intellectual property, rather than listing human beings. Jacob darted through a gap and pushed into the corridor with the index card stored in his mouth. He emerged into a lightless hallway and ran, the cadence of his steps carrying the trace of names out of the room. The junior guard at the corridor entrance hesitated, then closed his fist against the wall and let Jacob pass. That guard's choice, Claus' hesitation, created an immediate fallout. Some guards moved to pursue Jacob while others fell to restraining the doctor and securing the ledger. The physical confrontation left 3 consequences visible within minutes. 1. The ledger and scrap were on the bench, open and legible to whoever could read the handwriting. 2. The doctor was either restrained by guards or fled. Witnesses disagreed, but the immediate scene had stabilized into the carrier of proof. 3. Jacob was already beyond the records room with at least 1 copy. Each consequence pushed the narrative from fear into an uneasy, brittle hope. The narrator recorded movements with detached precision. Marek collapsed into a chair when the ropes were loosened. His hands shook and his jaw worked. He had blood from a split lip and smelled of disinfectant and old smoke. Claus stood near the doorway with his palms flat on the ledger, as if steadying it against the world. Erich, the clerk turned guard, sat on a crate, hands pressed into dirt, dark cuffs. The ledger revealed names and dates and a narrower twist no one had expected. 1 column was headed with a name that corresponded to a senior officer who rarely entered the camp. The ledger tied that officer to orders authorizing particular clarification procedures. The doctor's notes referenced a facility code and a pay ledger. That trace altered the moral geometry in the room. Those who had followed orders could now see that their orders were written, accounted for, and traceable. Camp doctor, Claus, voice flat, holding the ledger open to a page. Why were you listing code at 12? Claus pointed at the line where the funding code intersected with the entry for March 21st. He did not rise to accusation. He asked as a man would ask to confirm a fact. The doctor fumbled for a tone of superiority, but it came out as a sneer. Camp doctor, he said. This is routine notation. You do not understand paperwork. He grasped at bureaucracy as though it were a shield. Erich shook his head and quoted a ledger entry to the room, short sentences, measured. Erich. Funding code at 12, account office listed as Unit 5. Tests authorized by signature K. He read the shortened aloud. The sound of specific names wet the air with a new danger. When the ledger and the scrap were presented together, another character's decision pushed the plot outward. A mid-ranking clerk who had files to deliver beyond the camp, a man named Victor who had been introduced earlier as a courier for deliveries, stepped forward and offered a slow, professional solution. Victor. I can take the ledger, he said. I can secure it in a crate and bring it to a contact outside the camp. I know a route. Silence filled the records room because the statement was both a plan and a wager. The room divided on whether trust could extend beyond the gates. Marek looked at Victor and then at Jacob, who had run with the index card. He had to decide whether to hand the ledger to someone who might be intercepted or to force it into the hands of men who might hide it where no one would find it for decades. The choice made here resolved the chapter's primary conflict. Erich pushed the clipboard toward Victor and said, "Victor, take it now." Victor nodded and wrapped the ledger in an oilcloth, then folded it into a crate. Jacob reappeared, breathless and scraping, and slid an additional copy into Victor's sleeve. The three men moved as one toward the service gate. Guards at the gate argued, then allowed the courier to pass, because Victor carried food manifests and other legitimate paperwork. The small deception, wrapping the ledger among rations, was concrete and practical. As Victor left the compound, Marek felt a change in his chest, not expressed as sentiment, but as a loosening of his fingers around empty air. The ledger's removal was not a triumph. It was a tactical retreat with consequences. The doctor, pinned and bleeding at the temple, watched the crate exit under the gate. He groped for words and landed on a single, brutal command. "You will be punished for this." He named Marek, survivor. "You will pay for this," he said. Marek answered with a physical reaction. He spat blood into a basin and laughed once. Sharp and sudden. "Survivor," he said. "Lo, you and your notes will go on paper. People will read them." His voice was not a cry for victory. It was a factual statement of what he had seen. The immediate fallout settled into an odd administrative calm. Guards who had opposed the doctor's methods stepped back. Some took pages from the ledger and hid them in sleeves. A few, who had participated in the violence, looked at one another with new recognition. The ledger had rearranged responsibility into names and dates that could be shown and counted. That concrete record changed what could be denied. Later, in the records room, the narrator recorded a formal testimony. Marek sat at a low table, his wrists banded but unclenched, and spoke his name. He recited details, dates, places, the doctor's exact phrase about clarifying data. The narrator wrote each sentence as a fact. Marek's speech contained short lines and directness. "Survivor. It was for science. Survivor. They wrote the names. They numbered us." Each line was a deposit into the record pile that would either stay in the camp or be smuggled outward. Klaus gave an account too, stating plainly what he had seen. Klaus. He hit the ledger. "I saw the code. I couldn't look away." Erich signed next to his name. Jacob, when he returned, placed his traced index card on the pile and breathed as if his lungs had been tied and released. Victor had left. The crate was already rolling down the service road. The doctor's fate resolved into a modest list of outcomes. He was restrained, bound, and taken to a makeshift isolation cell while a council of officers debated action. Some favored silence, some feared exposure. The ledger's existence had removed the room's ability to camouflage abuse behind administrative language. Papers were not neutral now. They were evidence. Before dawn broke fully, the narrator wrote a note in the worn black notebook that would become the official account. The ledger was outside the camp, a copy in Jacob's seam, and Marek's testimony was recorded. The choice to move the ledger outward had consequences that would unfold after the chapter closed, but the immediate conflict, the forced erasure of the scrap and ledger, had been resolved. The chapter ended with a concrete sound, the service gate's bolt sliding home and the crate's wheels tapping the dust with a rhythm like a metronome. Marek watched the gate and felt nothing like triumph. His shoulders only relaxed enough to show exhaustion. A clerk closed the records room door and locked it, the key turning with a final, metallic click that named the action. The narrator wrote the ledger's initial inventory number down and underlined the name that matched the doctor's signature. The final line recorded what had been decided in the room. Some records would travel outward, some would remain inside, and the names now existed on paper and in mouths who could say them. The last sentence of the chapter was not a promise or a vow, it was a sound. The gate closed, the latch fell into place, and the crate rolled away toward an uncertain outside.